Alright, what's up everyone? Shane, aka Wild Poker here, and coming back at you with another pile solver series from some of the 510 hands that I played. Now last month, it's been a little while since we played these hands, but still some good things to study from and some good opportunity to learn here. We're going to have two hands today. They're both against Brothers Poker, a guy that I used to play against at 510 quite a bit. Unfortunately now, I've kind of forgotten some of my maybe individual reads I had on him. I have a kind of a vague memory that he was a reg. I don't think he was one of the strongest regs on the 510 tables, but definitely a decent player, capable of some good aggression, capable of some good reads and good plays like that. But maybe occasionally got a little bit out of the line, kind of a situation. Outside of that, I don't really remember too much here. As you can see in the picture here, the first hand, what I kind of wanted to do was something a little bit different. Instead of showing you guys the hands and the results right away, you can see the board, you can see the action, and I'll kind of walk you through the action real quick because sometimes this can be a little bit hard to read. But I'm in the small blind. This guy's in the big blind, and we're playing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-handed. Brothers Poker min opens. The button here calls. Out of the small blind, I 3-bet. Big blind folds. Brothers Poker just calls, and the button folds. And it's hard to tell because I'm covering the stack sizes here, but as you can see by my river shove, we're playing a little bit over 200 big blinds deep here for the 5-10 game. So that's something to keep in mind. And one of the reasons why my squeeze size is reasonably sizable here versus a min open. We could even maybe consider making it like 110 here, and I don't think that would be bad at all. Again, I kind of talked about this a little bit in my last video, but being out of position and being very deep, I at the time thought that we probably wanted to be checking our entire range, even in these 3-bet pots where we have a pretty strong range. Reason being is that when he has position and stacks, the stack to pot ratio is so deep, he can really exert a lot of pressure on a lot of parts of our range. If we're splitting it up between a betting and a checking line, or betting different sizings and checking line. So I, at this time, was taking the approach of just checking my whole range and looking to do a decent chunk of check calls and check raises, given that my checking range is quite a bit stronger here. So we'll kind of explore the checking range and see if we can learn a little bit more about what we want to do here. I called. Turn goes check, check. If I'm check calling the flop, we're always checking the turn. I think that's going to be kind of the standard there. Not really going to be looking to check call on this board texture and then find a donk here, I don't think. It does get checked back. And on the river, I go for a final check. My thinking here with both some of the hands that I'm going to be bluffing and value betting is that probably some of the hands that I'll be bluffing here, I think some of the times if it goes check check, we actually get to just win at showdown. But there's going to be some of those type of hands where if he bets, we want to check raise and turn it into a bluff. And also with some of our value bets on this kind of a board texture, I think that after I've 3-bet and checked multiple streets, I think this is a board texture where people can find definitely some checks on the turn to some thin value bets on the river, and then also find maybe a few extra bluff combos, just given that this board doesn't really crush or shouldn't crush our 3-betting range really all that hard. I think probably on this river here, parts of our range will definitely, after it goes check check, we'll just want to be betting out as a bluff. Those would be more so the hands that just couldn't win at showdown if it goes check check. We're going to want to bet those some of the time, and then also some of our value bets definitely, because we have bluffs here for sure, we're going to have some value bets as well. So we're not always checking this river, but in this case I did. I think the really interesting thing here is that when I live streamed this hand, at the time when people were watching this hand, everyone was saying check raise to 900 if I was going to check raise, or 1,000, and I opted to just check raise all in for a pretty massive bet. And so we're also going to explore this sizing a little bit and maybe explore some other sizing options as well. For me, in my mind, that this with a certain range of hands, this is the sizing that I think we just need to be making if we're check raising on the river. And so we'll talk about that. So I think the reason I wanted to have this covered up, guys, now that I've kind of walked through the action and had a little bit of my thoughts on maybe some streets here, is I would recommend pausing the video. And if you have any kind of range analysis tool, I would actually take some time and think about ranges from both sides here. What is the 3-bet range? What is the calling range? What does it look like for you? What parts of your range are checking? What parts of your range are just betting? Go through and kind of figure out what our ranges are in each street with this action and maybe some different actions for you. And after you've done that, then you'll unpause the video and we'll go right into the pile solver stuff, and you can actually compare your thoughts with pile solver and how I interpret the pile solver. So I think because we have all this blocked out, I think it's a much better opportunity for you guys that really want to go deep into your study and really check your lines and check your own thought process. Pausing the video, doing that, like I said, going through each street, and I think you guys will get a ton more out of this. So yeah, for those of you who want to pause the video, see you in the pile solver when we get back, and here we go. Okay, so the first thing we definitely want to do is show some of the ranges. Here is kind of what my range will be. My ranges do adjust definitely based on stack sizes, players at the table, any player reads I have, any metagame things that are going on. My ranges will change a little bit. I kind of best guessed what I think something like my range might have been at the time based on what I kind of vaguely remember about the player. Given that it's a squeeze spot, we're going to definitely be trying to squeeze with our strong value hands. Given that we're so deep, I wasn't too stoked about 3-betting the ace queen offsuit all the time. And these hands all the time, but some of the time I think they're going to go in there. This is always going to be a call if I'm not 3-betting it. A small fraction of the pairs just to have a little bit of a potential to make those sets some of the time, so we can have a little bit more board coverage, some of the suited connectors, and then a high, these are kind of our high bluffs over here. So my range will end up looking something similar to this for you guys to check out. And then here's my best guess at what his calling range is. Because we're so deep, I don't think there's going to be as many aces slow plays, but we still give him a decent chunk. I'm guessing that kings are never slow playing. I'm not 100% certain if at this stacked up, if he's always wanting to 4-bet the queens and the jacks. So I gave him some 4-bets and then a big chunk of calls, and then we're just calling with everything down here. And you can kind of see a lot of the stuff here that I'm not quite sure about. A little bit of reduced frequency, or if I think that he's going to be 4-betting it some of the time. And my guess is his cut off open and then call to the 3-bet is going to look something similar to this given the stack sizes. So there's the ranges there. And one thing I'll say is I definitely don't know if this is a GTO range. I didn't take a bunch of time to do all the math and make sure that we're not over bluffing here when we're 3-betting, or don't have enough bluffs or things like that. And because this is kind of a linear range, we're not picking stuff out here, we're not picking stuff out here. It doesn't really work exactly like bluffs versus value bet. Everything in our range here is going to have some equity when we continue in the pot. But I definitely, like, if you're trying to compare your range to my range right now, I could tell you right now that I can't tell you if this is going to be the absolute best range. And likely there's probably a more precise, better ranges out there for sure. But I think this is a good, reasonable, strong range. It's going to have some decent board coverage in a lot of different situations. And it allows us to, squeeze in the spot pretty aggressively as well. So something like that. We got the board texture, pot, our remaining stack sizes. Like I said, we still had a lot of stacks left. I threw down just a bunch of different bet sizings just to kind of see where everything would fall. Not really too sure, what was going to be the best for these stack sizes, but you can see for the overbets, I went with 200%. Given it an option to have a really big overbet given how deep we were. And started 150 here, 200 here, and we got the all-ins and stuff, things like that. So a lot of different options. Let's get right into it. So the first thing that really stood out to me, and hopefully is standing out to you guys, is that from the out of position, giving all these bet sizings, and given the opponent's strategies with the bet sizings that we gave him, you notice that we're just betting the vast majority of our range for the 1/3 pot c-bet sizing. And the reason for this is you can see our equity here on this board texture is 57%, given that we've got a pretty darn strong range. He has the 42% with definitely more things in his range that just don't connect with this board. So because of that, we're wanting to have a c-bet 94% here. Definitely contrary to, at the time of this hand, to my beliefs on how we wanted to play when we're very deep out of position. Even with a perceived range advantage, I kind of still felt like we should have been checking quite a bit. So definitely a key takeaway here is that we should be betting this 1/3. Fortunately, PIO is mixing checks with just about everything, so we can still take the check line. Although it'll be fractions of combos, it's still going to allow us to take the check and kind of analyze what we do after we checked. Here, so you can see I gave him a bunch of different bet sizes options like I talked about, and one of the big takeaways here is that after we're checking, he's never using pot or overpot. This is 60% pot, 1/3 pot, and then his checking option. So about 50% of his bet sizings go into these two, and then he's checking back quite a bit. Which, the reason he's checking back still at a very high frequency is because when we go back here, you can see that PIO, in order to protect his checking range of some of the weak give-ups, is, checking some of the stronger hands at a small frequency. It's balancing his checking range very well. So because of that, this guy just can't go crazy. He can't just go crazy and bet 100% because we have a balanced checking range. I would say probably for most of the people in our player pools, once we see the check on this board texture, I don't think the range is going to be as well balanced as PIO, so we might be able to get away with a much higher betting frequency than 49% or 50%. Pull this back up here. So the bet sizing used was half pot. I didn't give that option, but we have one that's pretty close here, and we can see that it's used a decent chunk of the time. And again, it looks like he's mixing just everything. The only hands that are really just always checking pretty much looks like the ace-3 spades. So, but yeah. Boom, we'll hit that bet size. So this one's a little bit hard to analyze because this is very different than going from a strategy of checking our whole range. If we are checking our whole range, I can tell you that this line here is going to be a much higher check raise frequency, and being able to call a ton. Folds will probably be less as well, being able to put some of our give ups into the check raise because we have so much stronger hands in our check raise that we can check raise for value. So we'll probably fold a little bit less, call a little bit less, and check raise quite a bit more. But in this case, we called. Let me pull this up to the side here. Turn was the 6 of hearts. And the important thing to note here is that, like I was saying on this board texture, we're not really trying to find donks at all. Pretty much just checking our whole range. And again, something that was interesting to me in a spot where I feel like there's definitely some things in his range that are trying to play for stacks. And also he can apply a lot of pressure to a lot of hands in our range, like even our pocket aces that don't have the heart, or pocket kings that don't have the heart that could have potentially taken this line. I think he could, at these stack sizes, we want to be applying a ton of pressure to us with his positional advantage. And so in my mind, I thought that the imposition player was going to want to have a pretty decent frequency of overbets. And we can see here that if we're giving him the 200% option, it's never used. Even the pot size option is very rarely used. So I can imagine that like a 150% pot or 120% pot is going to be pretty infrequently used, less than this pot size number. We can see that the number that it likes the most here is this 60% pot for 46% of the time. So this is pretty interesting to me. In my mind, like I said, we were going to want to have a decent frequency of overbets here, but PIO was telling us that nope, we just don't. And again, I think the reason for it is when you look at the equities, the out of position equity has decreased a little bit on this turn. We went from the 57% to 56%, but out of position still does have the range advantage. So because of that, he's not able to pile in a bunch of really big bets, I think is what we're seeing here. So it goes check, check. River was the 7 of clubs. And here you can see we are actually checking a very large portion of our range. Checking some rivered straights. Occasionally checking our flushes. Looks like our flush with the nut straight blocker is almost always checking. So mixing in a lot of strong hands in our checking range. Mostly going to be using this 1/3 bet to bet for some thin value and protection with our one pair hands. And our sets, but it looks like we're doing a lot of checking here with our straights and our strong flushes. I guess what are we trying to protect here is our weak one pair hands, but they aren't really checking either. They're going for that 1/3 bet sizing. I guess we're trying to protect our nope, we're bluffing all these. It's kind of hard to tell for sure because as you can see with this line, we have like fractions, 0.1 combos in each case. But I guess we're trying to protect like our ace kings that have some showdown value. The ace queens, our pocket eights. I think what it's trying to do is just the imposition player has enough weak hands that he should be bluffing. And we'll check this here when we check, but it's looking like I don't really see us checking a bunch of stuff that kind of needs protection here. So it looks like he has enough weak hands in his range that he's going to be bluffing at a decent frequency, so we're going to try to get in the check raise there. Plus, he should also have a decent chunk of value hands that should be betting at this point, so we're trying to get in the check raise with our really, really strong hands to see if we can't get a call out of those. So we do check, and actually surprisingly, I mean, even Pile Solomon knowing that he's going to check back 70% of the time, wants to check our nut flushes that often, which is pretty crazy. But we can see we're pulling in a decent chunk of bluffs from the just pure, like the queen high that doesn't really have any showdown value. Even the one pair hand is taking the 60% bet size again. It's kind of favoring this, not really favoring the pot hardly at all, and the jam is almost never used. So the hands that it looks like want to go all in for the most part are going to be the nut flushes here. Set, straight, set. Pretty easy check back here, set. Checking back the combos of 10s and jacks for the most part. If we do have the heart blocker, it looks like it can go for a really thin value bet here. So these are some of the thin value bets that we want to have check raises to put in a pretty tough spot with the aces as well. But that's interesting to me that we're seeing so much checking back from the imposition, and when Pile Solver's checking here, it knows that imposition is going to check back that high frequency, and even still, we're just trying to we're kind of letting him get away a decent chunk of the time from getting himself owned when we have these nut flushes, which is pretty surprising to me. And some of these sets here that I think are going to check raise. So he checks, bets the sizing. Obviously, any nut flush hand that we have is a snap check raise. And you can see here, I did give some options to PIO for the raise sizing. So here we have 1,000, which is kind of the sizing that a lot of people in the stream are commenting that we should have used. And then we have the all-in sizing, which was the sizing that I chose. And we can see that when we're check raising on the river with the nuts, we really, really want to have that all-in sizing, and then we're balancing it with a couple bluff combos. Almost never using this smaller sizing. I guess the balancing a little bit with like the ace 5, blocking some of the straights, and some of the weaker flushes and the straights here. But for the most part, we're just really wanting to use the all-in sizing with our bluffs and with our strong value hands. Even the 10 high flush or jack high, queen, king, pretty much all of our flushes actually. Finding some bluffs here with the straight blocker and blocking a couple flush combos. Only using for the most part, 8 of heart X. That would be one of our bluffs. I think we're turning kings with the king of hearts into a bluff, blocking some of the straights. And this is another thing that was interesting to me. Our pocket aces get turned into a check raise bluff here, blocking the nut flushes. And I think part of the reason that they're doing that is because we actually don't have many, given that we don't have a bunch of these different ace-x combos out down here. It's trying to find some potential nut blockers for some good check raise bluffs, using the ace of hearts or the king of hearts here. Mostly just folding the ace-queen combos. I'm guessing that's just due to some of the way that the ranges are interacting here. Having ace-queen just seems to be quite a bit... I think the queen is blocking a bunch of his bluff combos. As we saw, like he was bluffing all the queen-8 and those type of things. So blocking his bluff combos by us having the queen in our hand makes it worse for us to turn this ace-queen into a bluff. So it's just mostly folding everything here. So pretty interesting. Hopefully you guys saw some good takeaways from here. We'll go back here. I guess we'll analyze real quick what happens if we do bet the 1/3 pot, because I kind of wanted to show this as well. So let's say we do bet the 1/3. You can see Pile Solver is doing very, very few folding, very little folding, a lot of calling, and a decent chunk of raising as well. And some of the hands that are being folded here, we're also seeing some calling. Pile's wanting to use a lot of backdoor straights, backdoor flushes. Those are the main things that we're going to be defending with when we defend. And things that don't have those backdoor abilities are just getting folded, as you can see here. So that's a pretty important takeaway for you guys when you're trying to think about how you're defending versus these bet sizes, is look for any kind of backdoor equity, and it looks like we can just start finding ways to defend with that when we have that kind of backdoor. Obviously pairs here are going to be continuing 100% of the time. Also, when you're in PIO, as we usually do, let's see if we can check for things that just seem impossible for humans to defend, because the more that our opponents are under defending versus this 1/3 sizing, the more we get to use it and the more profitable it is for us. And I think on this kind of board texture, when we're betting 1/3 and stacks are so deep, I actually might wonder if sometimes people might over defend here. I could see people sometimes calling with the king queen, or let's even go here to the ace queen. Ace of spades, queen of diamonds. I think that's a hand that probably a lot of our opponents might float here versus the 1/3 pot sizing. Interesting that we're folding the 8 with the diamonds here. I think this is one that our opponents would be defending with as well. Probably the ace jacks we could see calling. So I think this actually might be a texture where our opponents might over defend just a little bit. And that's probably going to be to our advantage, because we are going to get to apply some decent pressure on the turn in this case, where we still have a pretty strong range. In a case where our range isn't quite as strong as this, if they're going to be over defending, that might, when we're shutting down with a lot of our range on the turn, that might allow them to take a little bit of advantage of us. But I think in most cases we actually see that human players probably under defend to the 1/3 pot c-bet. So anyways, he calls. And here's something, again, that when I was going through this surprised me quite a bit. This is a spot where I would have been trying to find, similar to the in-position player, being out of position here. Again, and this is what happened. So because he started folding a bunch of stuff when we bet the 1/3, when we get to the 6 of hearts, the equities drastically drop off for us. We go from having a very substantial equity advantage to having a pretty substantial equity, not pretty substantial, to having a small equity disadvantage. But for me, in my mind, had I bet this 1/3 on the flop, I think I would have been seeking to do some frequency of overbetting on the turn. And a lot of my bet sizings on the turn probably would have been funneled into this 2/3 sizing. And we can see here, if we are betting the flop, which Pile Solver loves, then we're going to continue again with a 1/3 sizing on the turn, which is another thing that was pretty surprising to me. If we'd played basically the majority of our range optimally, we would have been betting 1/3 on the flop, and then we would get to this turn here and find a decent chunk of 1/3 pot bets. But because of the increase in his advantage, finding a lot of checking. A lot of checking. And mixing everything is going to have some frequency of checks, it looks like. Even our turn flushes are going to be checking at a decent frequency. And I think probably my biggest mistake was I would have gotten to this turn, misinterpreted the equity advantage a little bit there, and I probably would have tried to overbet any of my ace-high flushes had I bet the flop. And then funneled in like these ace of hearts X hands in the overbet as well as a bluff. And then maybe some things like my pocket fives would have gotten put into the overbet category, blocking some potential straights, things like maybe even 6-7 blocking a set, and having some backdoors as well. And I would have been making a mistake. So that's good to see this, that we're looking in two places where one, my check on the flop was a mistake, but even had I been right and bet 1/3 on the flop, I probably would have been making a mistake on this turn. So we're definitely picking up some spots where I can find some improvement myself. And hopefully, when you guys went through your range analysis on your own, hopefully these are some spots where you might have been picking up, some potential mistakes of your own. So here, let's just kind of take Pile's line and just see what the best way to play our range is. Here are. We check, and this is pretty interesting to me here. So one, we're getting into a spot where Pile knows that it now has a slight advantage, but it's still choosing to use a smaller bet sizing if it's going to be betting. And in the other example, when I had checked the flop, called, checked the turn, it was doing a lot more betting in this 60% pot and a little bit less of the 1/3. But now we've got a little bit more of these kind of, much less here, a little bit more of the bigger bet sizing here, and a lot more of the 1/3 sizing. And still checking back at a high frequency, which we also saw as well. Again, kind of mixing everything. Pile is wanting to make sure it's getting money in with a lot of its flushes, though, for sure. On the turn here. So we're going to see very, very little checking back. If we go to the percents here, betting the 1/3 half the time and then checking a third of the time, or 30% of the time. But yeah, doing a lot of betting when we have the flushes. And because we're using the 1/3, we're protecting our pairs a little bit. Pretty interesting that we're checking aces here. I think actually I think it's actually pretty surprising. I was going to say that a lot of people would probably check their aces here, but when we get to bet 1/3 like this, I think a lot of people would actually find a bet with their aces. But it's deciding to check back the pocket aces and just protect the weaker pairs here, which is pretty interesting. So we're gonna continue to take the most frequent lines from PIO here. Let's get ourselves to the river. From our out of position perspective, we're doing quite a bit of checking, basically half and half. Very rarely using big bet sizing. So we like the 1/3 here. 1/3 is seeming to be very, very popular, even at these deep stacks with a lot of money left behind to be played for still here. Here, as the out of position player, if we had taken this line, we're definitely, it looks like we're wanting to check some of our flushes. You can see the EVs basically pretty darn even between betting a blocking bet sizing and betting and checking in a lot of these spots here. And similarly with our sets, so it looks like the only hand that wants to bet huge is pocket fives. The ace-5 of hearts, mixing in a couple bluffs here. I think we could just bet pretty much, and by huge I mean this is still only a pot size bet, kind of do away with that and then just funnel everything back down to this sizing. And it's because, as you can see, the EVs are between checking and potting for some reason are about the same. So we're going to take the, well, I guess the most common line is check here, keeping in mind that we're actually checking quite a bit of flushes. Check. And here we have 60% pot, here we have pot. A lot of checking back again. So again, PIO's checking the nuts, knowing that the imposition is still going to check back quite a bit, but it's willing to take that risk knowing that it's going to get to check raise and make a big bet at some frequency here. And here we're almost 45%, so that's quite a bit better than 30% like it was in the last time. So the most common line here. And again, we're seeing the small option just never used. We're just basically, we're folding a ton, calling, and then if we are check raising, we want to use that really big sizing. And that's because the value hands that are check raising, it looks like, are the flushes. And then the bluffs are the nut straight, I guess, is strong enough as well. And I think part of this that we can pretty confidently check raise nut straights and nut straight blockers as bluffs, and even the pocket fives. I guess the pocket fives is, again, one of the hands that wants the smaller sizing. Check raising the 10 of hearts, blocking some of the potential couple flush combos and straight. But one of the reasons that we can confidently check raise pretty much any flush that we have at this point is because if you remember back here on the turn, Pile Solver wanted to be betting all of its flushes on the turn at a pretty high frequency. There was some checkbacks, but a lot of the flushes were getting bet here. So if that's the case, and when he gets to the river and is, and is now betting here, we can pretty happily just start putting in money when we have flushes. And it looks like here, the ace of hearts, queen is reasonable shove. Not so much queen X. Well, we still see this queen. We still see some queen X bluffs for sure here. So we are still blocking those bluffs, but we also see just a ton of other like thin value bets. More so than we did last time, because you remember he was checking back a lot more on the river in the first example when we ran through it. So now because he has a higher betting frequency, having the nut flush blocker, I think for us, when we check, he bets 220. Having this nut flush blocker for a couple of these combos is good enough that it's a slightly more profitable line to check raise it here instead of just folding all the ace queens, the ace kings, some called some of the time here, which is pretty interesting. Finding a couple bluffs here with these aces and kings. So had we taken this line where we bet, call, goes check, check, we're check raising not so much, but at a when we do check raise, again, using that big sizing. So I think that's another big takeaway that we saw in both examples here, where when we are check raising, we really want to just funnel it into the big all-in sizing. And so that's probably something that I'm not doing quite enough when I was playing in the deep stacks, is I was finding some of my check raise sizings, instead of really putting on the pressure for the full all-in sizing, I was occasionally finding sizings that were more similar to this. But it looks like occasionally I got it correct and just went for the big drop in the hammer sizing, put it all in, put the pressure on, let them figure out what to do. And I think in a lot of cases, it seems like most of the time Pile Solver is going to agree with that. So what I want to do next here is kind of show you guys something that I thought was pretty interesting. As I've been doing with a lot of the videos that you've seen, is I've run one that has a lot of complexity, a lot of different bet sizing options. And then the next time I run one that's similar, but it just cuts it down to the lines that Pile Solver tends to use the most. And we want to compare the EVs and see if we can't just simplify our strategy in both players' cases and come away with something that makes it easy for us, but really doesn't sacrifice too much in terms of EV. So let me pull this up here real quick. Here, very complex, lots of different bet sizings, different donk sizings going on here. And then when we get to this one, as you can see, quite a bit more simple. And like I noted, the in position wasn't really ever using the big bet sizings, so I took away that option. But because it wanted to use the big bet sizings a little bit, what I did was, instead of going 60% here, I gave him a slightly larger bet of 65%. And that was really the main difference. We saw that from the out of position, pretty much almost always wanted to use a 33. There was a little bit of the 66% sizing. We might have hurt ourselves a little bit here by not giving us the 66% sizing. I think that is one of the things that was kind of a negative for us. But let's compare these EVs. The out of position here is 132 in this case, where we have all this different stuff going on. And the out of position here now is 129. So we lost a big chunk of EV out of position, taking away some of these options. But I think actually the biggest thing that we'll see is that this 65% bet is a lot better in this case than the 60%. I think the main thing that actually changed all these numbers, and I'll explain why when we go through it, is that I just gave Pile Solver a bet sizing that it liked a lot better. And it's possible that, maybe 67% or 70% might be a little bit better. But again, like I said, the reason I upped it was because I noticed that, Pile did seem to want to use a little bit bigger bet sizing some of the time. So it kind of was hinting that maybe something a little bit bigger than 60% was better. So I upped it a little bit, and it definitely thinks that this is better. So maybe we might be, working towards a bet sizing that we can add into our own games at a high frequency and, be doing a little bit better than, 50% pot or 60% pot or 75% pot. I'm not saying that's the case for all these situations, but when you see such a drastic change, in EV here, and when you see some of the other things that I'm going to show you, it's pretty darn surprising. So let's go to the browser here. Let's go back to the root. First thing, with all the changes that we made, we went from betting 94% for the 1/3 sizing to betting 85%, and then checking a little bit more often. I actually don't exactly understand why that changed, because we're still giving the in position the same frequency of being able to, the same bet sizing option for being able to raise when we bet. The ranges are still the same. I don't know why we started to want to check more. I think probably one of the reasons is because, I guess let's pull this up here. When we bet 76, he calls, we get the 6 of hearts. There might be a lot of turns where we decide to start punishing him with some bigger bet sizings, and because we don't have that option on a lot of those different turns, we can't bet as much. That's my only guess. Because now on the turn we only have the option of the 1/3 sizing, so we don't get to punish his weaker continuing range as much, which means that we have to check a little bit more. I'm not certain if that's true, but that's my best guess as to why we ended up, even with still the same equity advantage here on this flop, we ended up checking a substantial amount more. So let's first go through the check line. Okay, so the first huge takeaway here is just look how much we're betting at this 65%. And let me pull this up and we'll compare these two. So before, when it was only 60%, PIO only wanted to bet about 13% here, and was funneling a lot of the bet sizings down here into the 76% and still checking back a bunch. We gave it the 65% option, and it just really started funneling a ton of bets into that size, even took some out of here and some out of the check because it likes this bet sizing so much. And this is exactly why I'm saying that, why I think putting 65% instead of 60 increased the imposition's EV so much, is because PIO just really likes this bet sizing. I think it might be a good experiment for a lot of you guys who have PIO to mess around with sizings around 65 to 70 and see if you see some of these similar trends, from 60 to 65 to 70, in those things, and see if you see some trends like this. And there might be some patterns there. Maybe it's just the case. Well, I'm sure there's some, the board texture, the way the ranges are interacting and stuff like that that's happening here. I'm sure there's some influence from that. But there's also definitely the possibility that we could find some kind of pattern here where this difference between 60 and 65%, it might show up in a lot of other different situations as well. So I thought that was a pretty cool find, just to see that slight difference in sizing made this huge difference in both EV and frequencies. So something to take away for you guys for sure. So here, unfortunately, we don't have the bet sizing that he used anymore. So we're going to go with the 65%. We can see we're doing, at that bet sizing, we're doing very little check raising, almost exclusively calling. And didn't give him the donk option here. The donk option, which was almost never used in the more complicated example. And again here on the turn, 65%. And let's go back and compare this real quick. So here, let's say we had used the 60%. First off, we use the 60% and definitely get a little bit higher check raise frequency. Look at how much more betting is happening here on the turn now. When we use 65-65, we're now betting 65. We're betting a very, very high frequency compared to this line. So we're just, because we're able to apply a little more pressure to a decent chunk of the out of positions range without introducing ourselves to a ton of risk with an overly large bet, we just get to bet a bunch here is what it looks like. we go from betting 48% to now betting 65%, which is substantial. It's huge. So here, betting 65, very, very small frequency of check raising, mostly just calling and a lot of folding, obviously, so we're going to use the call. Because I clicked the all in, it has us donking occasionally with, I guess, some flushes, but checking. And here on the river, what options did I give? 33% or all in. My guess was that because it wasn't much of an overbet here, that PIO would probably favor a really big bet or checking back. And I think that's the case that we're getting. It might be the case that if we throw in 65 in again here, we'll see a ton of these bets funnel down to the 65 and, you know, or 70% bet or something like, or pot, and maybe some checks get funneled into that. But for now, this is what we got to work with. Yeah, basically he's shoving and we're calling with flushes and straights. So the other option was we check. Oh wait, that's the first one we went through. So betting here. So let's see if we kind of tested the theory. The one thing I said, like one of the reasons that we're checking so much is because we can't apply a bunch of pressure. So let's see, we call 6. It has us continuing to bet at a very, very high frequency. We're not giving up as much as we were here in this example, real quick. Here you can see we were checking 64%, 32%, so it flipped. But with the small bet sizing, we're still not really applying a lot of pressure. He still gets to continue with a lot of his range. I don't know if that's, looking at this here again still, I don't know if that's a good explanation for the fact that we can't really, oh, because I said it was on different board textures. The turn is interacting with it in a way that we don't want to use that big bet sizing. So let's go to like the ace of clubs. Never. 225. Sorry, 202. So the ace of clubs is one of our best cards. And we're still not using this. So that's probably not the actual answer, to be honest. So maybe leave it up to you guys to figure out why we have to check so much more when we lose some of our options here. Because I don't think, looking at that, it doesn't look like it's the case of that on a lot of different turns we end up being able to make a really big bet and apply more pressure to his range. I don't see that being the case here when I was looking at, you know, just the ace of clubs turn there. So anyways, here in this example, we just continue betting the 1/3. He's defending at a very, very high frequency, as he should. And I wonder how often we go for the check raise. Here we do see the 1/3 bet used by him quite a bit on the river, which is, I think, somewhat rare to see one position in position on the river or even on turns betting small sizing. And we do see again when we check raise, we're going for the big time check raise. So that was one of the common things. We just wanted to check that. You know, if we have a smaller option, do we use it? Doesn't really look like we ever use it in any of the you know, different lines, whether it goes check call or bet check or bet check. You know, when we're check raising on the river, we seem to really favor just using the big sizing. And the one thing to keep in mind here, one of the reasons we do use the big sizing is because we have quite a few combos of potential nut hands. I think if we got to the river and we didn't have that, you probably wouldn't see a big bet sizing. And if we could never have the nuts, then I don't think you'd ever see a big check raise. Unless the opponent couldn't have it either, I guess. So anyways, that was that hand. I will pull up the actual hand just to show you guys, because I'm sure some people were dying, even though I don't think it's that really important for analysis. Just for those that wanted to see it for the entertainment factor. Here's the hand. I ended up having the Ace of Hearts, 2 of Hearts here, and he showed up with pocket 5s. And if you look at the pile line, if I'm bluffing a balanced frequency here, which it looks like I would probably get pretty close, and I might have actually even overbluffed, because if I had the Ace of Hearts Queen here, excuse me, if I had the Ace of Hearts Queen here, I would have check shoved as well, which was a bluff that in the first example PIO didn't want to use when we took this line, because it blocked a too heavy chunk of his potential bluffs. So maybe I might even slightly overbluffed here, but yeah, we ripped it in, and I think he made a reasonable call. After this guy spammed emotes for like ever as he was time making. This original picture was much longer. I had to cut it out. Anyways, so that was that hand. Hopefully there was some good things in there for you. I have these files saved, guys. So, if you have more questions, or, want me to, run some numbers and, post some screenshots of different turns or rivers and see if things change, I could do that for you. If you have questions about any of the EVs or betting lines that we see, what hands in what spot, things like that, definitely post those in the comments, and I can definitely follow up with you and add, answer whatever question you have there. But hopefully with what we saw there, and if you had taken the time to do your ranges previously and done that checking as we went through it, I think you guys should have probably gotten quite a bit out of this, because as I went through it, like as you could hear me saying, there was a lot of spots where I would have taken a line that it seems like PIO just never wants to take. So definitely a good experience for me to go through that one. Okay, so now we've got one more hand here, guys. All right, and this one I'm not going to blur it out like I did the last time. This one's a little bit more for entertainment value, but hopefully there's a few things to be learned out of this. So this hand happened actually about 15 minutes after the Ace-2 versus 5s hand versus the same guy. I had noticed that he was probably a little bit tilted. Like I said, I think he's a good player, so I don't think he wasn't just going crazy, but he was acting a little bit faster. It seemed like he was playing slightly more aggressive, and it could have just been a function of the hands that he was getting. But I felt like there was a little bit of metagame going on there, and he was a little bit more likely to do something kind of spazzy, basically. And we ended up getting this hand here. Basically, I'm opening under the gun. He 3-bets a very small sizing for our stack sizes. Again, we're 200 big blinds deep here. We see this guy call in the small blind, and obviously with the price that I'm getting, never going to be folding pocket 9s here. I call. And this was the reason I brought up this hand, the main one, is a lot of people think that we should have never ever check raised this flop, and I strongly disagree with that. So we'll look into that, and we'll also look into if he should ever just jam over my check raise. My answer is no, but we'll see what PIO says. And yeah, we'll just kind of look into it. Not going to really get into this hand too deep, but basically, I think in general, even without maybe the little metagame that he was maybe a little bit tilted, I think I would still be check raising the pocket 9s here at a reasonably high frequency. And if I had pocket 3s, I would be check raising those as well. And I would have a hard time check raising my hands like King Queen and Ace Queen, but We'll see if Pile says that we check raise those. My bluffs would come from things like my King 10 suiteds, my Ace Jack suiteds, Ace 10 suiteds, anything that has like a backdoor flush draw. So the club, diamond, spade combos, the heart combos I would probably just be folding at this sizing. But we would be able to find some bluffs with those, I think. Jack 10, I don't know if I said that, but Jack 10 would be the only one that we don't need the backdoor flush draw as well, I think. I did have to fudge it a little bit, obviously, because as you can see, this was three-handed on the flop. So I just, used the pot size, kind of guessed, at both of our ranges here, and just pretended that he wasn't in the pot to see, in a heads-up environment, what we should be doing here. And let's go ahead and take a look at that. Okay, so again, we have a more complex option, and then we will look at a simple option and see if there's any takeaways from a simpler version. For our ranges here, it gave me something like this. I'm probably not always going to be 4-betting queens here. This might actually be an always call in this situation because, like I said, I thought he might have been a little bit tilted. And I don't really, with queens, I'm not really too interested in opening myself up to a 4-bet until I'm sure that he's getting really wide with his, or a 5-bet, until I'm sure he's getting really wide. And, playing out of position in a 4-bet pot with queens when we're still pretty darn deep could be somewhat difficult as well. And also, I don't remember my exact thoughts at the situation, so I'm not quite sure if I would have been 4-betting queens or if I would have been calling with the queens here, given some of the metagaming things that were going on. So I only gave me half. I think we're going to be just calling with all these. At these stack depths, I'm somewhat unlikely to be opening the, and with the player lineup, I'm somewhat unlikely to be opening the smaller pairs here, so we're not going to have those. I'll still be opening all my suited ace-X. Some of these will be 4-bet bluffs some of the time. Probably, given the fact that it was a pretty small 3-bet, and we had a cold caller, so we're getting good price, and we have the best relative position there, given post-flop. Going to be doing a lot of calling with anything in my opening range, and probably not so much 4-betting. So this is the range that I got here. And here's kind of the range that I gave for him. Again, not really too sure what he's doing with a bunch of stuff, so the things that I'm less sure about, we just gave him a small frequency of, and then as I get more and more sure that it could be in the range, the frequency gets higher. So we gave him something about like that. And again, not as deep as we were in the last hand, but still a lot of money we played for here. And you guys can see all the bet sizing options. So let's get into it. Oops. In this situation, I'm always going to be checking, obviously, so that's a given. One thing I wanted to check was, I tend to not really ever use the 50% size pot bet. I just tend to use more of the 1/3, or if I'm not using the 1/3, go to the 66 or something like that, or pot. And so I put the 50% pot in just to see if it's a sizing that PIO ever uses, and because he used it, and it looks like it's used at a very high frequency, which was pretty surprising to me. Now keep in mind that PIO thinks we're heads up here. If we could have a 3-handed solver, my guess is that it would actually want to use a little bit smaller sizing, and we'd probably see more bets go into this sizing when it gets multi-way. But even if we were heads up, it's pretty surprising to me that we see this sizing used so often. So it looks to me like I might have to find more spots to use that half pot in my cash game. And so we have the 1/3, half, and 2/3 here. It looks like the most common is half, so let's just go with that. I did want to see, again, because I check raised here, how often we're check raising. It looks like we're actually wanting to find a decent frequency of check raises. Again, if we go back and look at just everything that's betting here, I mean, we definitely need to just start applying pressure to this kind of a wide range. Obviously, it doesn't have 100% of all these combos. If you look at it broken down here, there's only small fractions of a bunch of this stuff. But if he's betting all this, we still need to start applying some pressure. So we can see that 10% check raise coming in. Nines, calling or check raising seems to be roughly the exact same EV, but we're still check raising it at a very high frequency because it's such a strong hand. And if we do that, we get to put in some bluffs that really couldn't win the pot otherwise. Those coming from just some ace highs here, basically our 0 EV bluff. It's using some random, here we can see like the king tens that I talked about, and it's actually still even using the hearts. I was thinking that I probably wouldn't use the heart combos, I would just fold them, but we could see that actually raising and calling are similar EVs, so if he's betting that wide of a range, our king 10 here is actually strong enough, of hearts even, is strong enough to continue with either a raise or a call, that's a little bit interesting to me. It means that I probably would have been, not probably, I definitely would have been overfolding a little bit here. Well, I guess we do have the gut shot. So the king 10, sorry, did notice for a second, totally lost track of the fact that we had a gut shot. I think I actually would have been able to call with the king 10. Let's look at one that, like ace 10 only has the back door straight instead of a gut shot, and that's a clear fold. Okay, so we're a little bit more on track here than what I thought. But even so, continuing with a gut shot there, half pot bet, three-way pot, is a little bit difficult, but when you consider the stack sizes left to play behind, the times that we get to hit that gut shot, it's really going to hopefully pay off pretty well for us, so that makes sense. Obviously anything, if we have a top pair, we're going to continue. And we can see here that Pile Solver actually does want to check raise with ace queen at a pretty high frequency. King queen almost never, so it looks like blocking his potential aces and blocking, obviously having the top pair is pretty darn valuable for us. And again, keep in mind he's c-betting at a very high frequency here, so that's another reason why we're able to do that. And obviously having a backdoor flush draw is going to be more valuable for us. As you can see, the EV is higher, definitely with the backdoor flush draw. Okay, so basically the moral of the story here is I think we definitely want to be check raising with the nines. And this is, well, actually when we see how often Pile Solver is defending with re-raises here or calls, even if I think that he's a little bit tilted and maybe going to be getting a little crazy, I still wouldn't expect people to be finding these 5-4 re-raises, these 6-5 re-raises. So, I mean, Pio was actually seeming to get even more aggressive than what I thought he was going to be doing versus the check raise here. I do expect to see like probably every pair at least call once when we go for the check raise there. Obviously Jack 10, any kind of backdoor straight, backdoor flush draw combination continuing. So I did expect to see a lot of calls from him, and it seems like obviously Pile's backing that up as well. But this is one thing that surprised me here was seeing this. Just taking a hand that has zero equity pretty much. I guess there is a backdoor straight possible and a backdoor flush possible, but a hand that I think a lot of us would have a hard time making a bluff with and finding that bluff. It's always interesting to see these kind of things, Pile doing stuff like this that I definitely would not be doing. I made a mistake here and didn't give him the option for the all-in, so we only have the pretty small re-raise in position, but reasonable, and we can see it's used quite a bit. I do have in the simple version I gave the all-in, and we'll check on the on that sizing option. So there's not much more to analyze here because you can see the all-in was on the flop. But we did get a chance to look at some of the check raise frequency and how he defends versus our check raises, or how players should defend. And outside of like this kind of stuff and maybe some of these ace X re-raises, I expected a pretty similar kind of defense at the time. And you could see the nines is just a clear check raise from our perspective. Let's go over here to the simple one. And basically, because the 50% sizing was used so often, I just gave him that as the only option here. We can see that we gave him the all-in as possible. And we're not going to go past the past the flop action here. Because like I said, this one's a little bit more for entertainment, a little bit less of the educational side. Other than really making sure to note that even out of position, even on a board texture that's not super draw heavy, we still definitely want to be finding some check raises if there's an opportunity where we can have hands that are very strong for the situation. I do think that is going to be a takeaway for a lot of people that are watching this. Okay, so obviously we're checking, and you can see when we give him only the 50% option, again keeping in mind that we're playing heads up here in PIO world, and we weren't heads up in the actual hand, but we're actually betting 2% more when we only have this one option, checking a little bit less. So in this case, PIO really likes this 50%, which is pretty cool to see. And here, before it had us check raising at 10.27. Now, because he's betting just a little bit more, we get to check raise a little bit more. And again, you can see nines are our highest frequency check raise. And then again, a lot of the gut shots with back doors, and even some small frequency of the queen 10 with top pair, with gut shot here, back doors here. Ace 2, definitely a bluff that I probably wouldn't have found. You can see that the bluff here is the same EV as a fold, roughly, for the ones that have the backdoor flush. But if you're playing perfect poker, you definitely need to be making 0 EV bluffs. So that's why you can see it bluffing here a small fraction of the time with these hands, which, even though it says negative there, that's essentially 0. Anyways, we raise here, and I wanted to see what it looks like with the option of the go all in. And you can actually see that it uses it with kings 1.2% of the time. I think that's the only hand that goes over 1%. The 0.1, 0.6. So pocket kings. Pocket kings likes the shove. Needs protection from some of our ace high shoves or ace high check raises and things like that, or all of the gut shots, backdoors, things like that. And as far as re-raising here, definitely doing a decent frequency of re-raising for the smaller sizing. You can even mix in your ace queen, some king queen, re-raises for value, mixing in the 9/8s with backdoor flushes as a bluff, blocking one of our most common sets, which is pretty nice for him. Still, we're seeing a small frequency of these re-raises. I do want to check here one thing. When we re-raise, he's getting some of our king jack, some of our king 10, all of our ace jack. So I mean, he's definitely getting better hands to fold, and I think that's why he's raising these 6-5, is because he's not really blocking any of our folds with that. Because the folds he's getting are coming from here, the jacks and the 10s. So that's probably why, is because it's just not blocking any of the folds. Or not probably, I think that's definitely why. So anyways, that's that hand, guys. Like I said, I'm not going to go super deep into that one, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about our check raise frequency on the flop, and a little bit about if we ever do want to consider jamming on this kind of board texture. And the answer is no. But definitely think, especially when stacks are deep here, and there's a lot of money left to be played for. When we do have, a hand that's very close to the nuts, it looks like we want to be check raising and trying to build a pot with that, and even on a pretty dry board texture. So make sure that for you guys in your games, if you're not implementing check raises on these kind of board textures, that you look for spots where you can do that with both some of those bluffs that we talked about, and obviously some of your really strong value hands. So that's going to be it for the video for today, guys. Like I said, I have all these files saved, so if you have comments about, if you want any more information on anything from the PIO, if maybe you saw something that interested you that you want me to bring back up, we can definitely do that. I'm happy to answer all your questions in the comments, or if you want to come into my stream, I stream under WoW Poker. You can definitely come in there and ask questions. I do study sessions at the end of most of my streams, so it would be a good time to review any of these hands that you have, or questions from your own hands. But yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing what you guys have to say, and thank you again for watching. See you guys next time.